Greetings and welcome back to my ongoing series on the lives of freshwater snails. In Chapter 1 of our story, we looked at the ramshorn snail, and now, in Chapter 2, we'll be taking a close look at another common freshwater snail known as the bladder snail, but they're also sometimes referred to as tadpole snails. There are dozens of species of bladder snails, but the ones that we typically see in our aquariums are Phycella acuta. They're native to the northeastern United States and Canada, but they can now be found all around the world except in the coldest polar regions such as Antarctica. In fact, bladder snails are probably the most widespread snails in the world, and in many places they're considered an invasive species that outcompetes the native snails for space and food. And one of the reasons for their global success is that they're a very adaptable species that can thrive in stagnant water where there are very low levels of dissolved oxygen. They're also very tolerant of poor water quality and pollution. In fact, they've even been found living in sewage treatment plants. Nonetheless, bladder snails can find their way into your aquarium by hitching a ride on live plants, either as eggs or as tiny snails. And if there's an abundant supply of food and an absence of predators, their numbers can increase at an alarming rate, causing many people to refer to these snails as pest snails due to their rapid rate of reproduction. Bladder snails are much smaller than ramshorn snails. They typically reach a maximum length of around half an inch or just under 13 millimeters. And just like the ramshorn snail, bladder snails have two tentacles that they use to help them gather information about the world around them. These tentacles contain special cells that help them locate their food, avoid predators, and find other bladder snails with which to mate. The mouth of the snail contains a feeding structure known as a radula that's a little bit like a tongue that's covered in thousands of tiny teeth that are used for scraping away little bits of food which are then swallowed. Both the ramshorn snails and the bladder snails are scavengers, so they have a diet that consists of just about anything soft enough for them to eat. And if something dies in your aquarium, they'll rush right in to dispose of the body, and that's one of the more useful things about having these little snails in your tank, because they're more than happy to clean up any leftover food, dead plants, or dead tankmates. The bladder snail gets its name from a special gas-filled bladder that's used to store air that they take in from above the surface of the water. This air-filled bladder makes it a lot easier for the snail to move around in much the same way that a swim bladder makes it easier for a fish to swim. And just in back of the swim bladder is where the digestive tract ends and the waste products of digestion are released. The technical term for this area is the poop chute. Nonetheless, once the air has been taken into the bladder, it's then stored in a lung-like void inside the snail called the mantle cavity. This cavity is lined with microscopic blood vessels that can extract the oxygen from the air, at which point the oxygenated blood is then sent to the heart, which then pumps it to the rest of the body via the bloodstream. So the bladder and the mantle cavity act like a lung that allows them to get oxygen from above the waterline. And this is one of the many adaptations that enables these snails to live in stagnant water where there's very little dissolved oxygen. And this lung-like cavity is also present on the ramshorn snails and the mystery snails as well, and that's why they're all known as pulmonate snails. However, it's important to note that the ramshorn snail uses iron to transport the oxygen atoms through their bloodstream, and that's why their blood is red, just like ours. But our friend the bladder snail doesn't use iron to capture and move the oxygen atoms through their bloodstream. They use copper instead, which is a much less efficient way of bringing oxygen to their cells. As a result, in stagnant water, bladder snails have to surface for air much more frequently than ramshorn snails. Now, let's take a look at how these snails fill their bladder with air. As the bladder snail approaches the top of the aquarium, it turns itself so that the left side of its body is facing the surface of the water. Then it uses a special pore-like opening known as a pneumostome to pull in air from above the surface of the water. This air is then stored in its bladder as well as inside a lung-like chamber called the mantle cavity. This bubble of air not only supplies the snail with oxygen, but it also makes it easier for the snail to move around with that big heavy shell on its back. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the ramshorn snail uses iron to capture the oxygen atoms and move them through its bloodstream, which is a far more efficient way of transporting the oxygen than the copper used by the bladder snail. And this loss of efficiency is probably why the bladder snail has another way to get oxygen into its bloodstream that the ramshorn snails don't have. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But first, I'd like to show you how the bladder snail can also release the air inside its shell, which will cause it to sink, just in case it needs to make a quick getaway. Ejecting the air inside its shell makes the snail less buoyant, and then all it has to do is let go of whatever it's holding on to, and it drops right to the bottom of the tank. Now let's look at a bird's eye view of the bladder snail as it crawls along the surface of the water while opening and closing its pneumostome to pull in air. The pneumostome opens, the snail pulls air into its bladder, and then the pneumostome closes. And now it's time for a short commercial break because these ads help me earn a little bit of money so that I can continue bringing you these amazing videos. But don't go away because I've saved some of the best stuff for last. And we're back. Thanks for sticking around to see all the cool stuff that I have to show you next. Now, if you recall, I mentioned earlier that the blood of the bladder snail isn't very efficient at capturing and moving the oxygen through its bloodstream, so it has another way of getting the oxygen that it needs to survive. Let's take a closer look. Notice these small finger-like extensions visible on the outside of the snail's shell? These are special parts of the snail's mantle called mantle lobes, but they're also sometimes referred to as false gills. These mantle lobes are important structures that are unique to the bladder snail family. They're present on both sides of the snail's shell and contain numerous microscopic blood vessels all along the surface that's used to extract oxygen directly from the water. The number and shape of these mantle lobes are very specific to each species of bladder snail, so they're useful for helping biologists distinguish between similar-looking species of the same genus. Attached to the mantle lobes, you can also see where the snail's mantle extends along the outer rim of the shell, and this is the part of the snail's mantle that secretes the new material that forms the shell as the snail grows. And in case you didn't know, the snail's mantle is the fleshy part of the snail that covers its internal organs. But as I've just pointed out, the mantle has several other important functions as well. And here's another angle showing the part of the snail's mantle that produces material for new shell growth. These mantle lobes also contain touch-sensitive nerve endings that help the bladder snail detect the presence of predators such as snail leeches and carnivorous fly larvae. And when these mantle lobes sense that something is touching them, the bladder snail activates a very special set of muscles called physid musculature that it uses to drive off the intruder by rapidly twisting its shell back and forth. These muscles help the bladder snail defend itself against slow-moving predators, and it's thought that this ability to rapidly shake its shell might be one of the factors that has helped the bladder snail invade new habitats all around the globe. And it doesn't have to be a predator. In fact, anything that touches these mantle lobes can cause the same behavior, because as a general rule, bladder snails do not like to be touched. So they have a special way of saying, "Back off, I'd like to be left alone." And I'm sure that anyone that has bladder snails in their aquarium have probably seen this behavior before without ever knowing why it's happening. Well, now you know. It's because something has touched one of their mantle lobes, which causes the snail to try and remove the source of irritation by wiggling its shell. All snails move around using a method of locomotion known as ciliary gliding. And how this works is that the snail uses its foot, which is this part right here, to produce a layer of mucus that acts as a lubricant, making it easier for the snail to crawl over any surface. And this near constant production of mucus is very costly for the snail, so they have to eat a lot of food in order to keep up with the demands of this very inefficient form of locomotion. But the actual movement itself is generated by thousands upon thousands of tiny hair-like structures called cilia that line the bottom of the snail's foot. The cilia work like little legs that move in a coordinated fashion that propels the snail over any surface. They can even turn upside down and crawl along the top of the water, and they're only able to do this because the mucus created by the snail's foot gives the cilia something to grab onto as they propel the snail forward across the surface of the water. And when food is scarce, they can even feed on the little bits of detritus and biofilms that float on the surface as well. Now, not only does this mucus serve as a lubricant to make it easier for them to move around, but it has another very interesting function that most people are completely unaware of. Let's take a look and learn a little bit more. Bladder snails can secrete a trail of mucus that extends between the substrate and the surface of the water. Then they crawl along this mucus trail as they travel between the top and the bottom of the aquarium. The snail holds on to the strand of mucus by wrapping its foot around it. This allows the cilia that lines the bottom of the snail's foot to walk along the strand of mucus as they propel the snail up to the surface and then back down again. These strands of mucus act like a tether that allows the snail to leave and then return to the same location over and over again. I like to think of it as a mucus highway because it conjures up some very strange images in my mind that are pretty gross on one hand while being incredibly fascinating on the other. Be sure to notice how the snail's foot folds completely to form a closed loop around the invisible strand of mucus. They use well-defined roots over and over again, and each time a snail passes over the same trail, a new layer of mucus is added to the original strand, which makes it stronger and stronger each time a snail crawls along the same path. Unfortunately, this trail of mucus extending between the substrate and the surface isn't visible to the naked eye, but you can definitely see that the snails are leaving and then returning to the same location over and over again as they travel along the same strands of mucus. And they move more slowly when they're descending because the air inside their shell wants to lift them up to the surface, so they're much faster when they're climbing up to the top of the tank. So you can't see it right now, but this snail is crawling along an invisible strand of mucus that's attached to this little piece of driftwood. And what's even more incredible is that these mucus trails are strong enough to hold more than one snail at a time, which can sometimes result in a traffic jam as two snails use the same mucus thread to travel in different directions. These midwater collisions can get quite heated as the snails battle over who has the right of way. Here's a group of snails at the on-ramp to a different mucus highway than the one we were just looking at. And once again, there's a traffic jam as several snails try to use the same strand of mucus to travel in different directions at the same time. These mucus trails are less dense than the water, so they float, and as far as I can tell, they're not usually attached to anything at the surface unless you have floating plants. Every once in a while, the mucus thread between the surface and the substrate will break, and then when a snail reaches the end of that particular thread, you'll see it lose contact with the mucus, and then it'll shoot up to the surface as the air in its bladder lifts it up to the top of the tank. And here's another popular spot in this tank that these snails use to climb up to the surface for a breath of air. One snail after another climbs up this little piece of driftwood and finds the thread of mucus that leads to the surface. I've noticed that these snails seem to prefer crawling up to the surface slowly. Otherwise, they could just let go of whatever it is that they're holding on to, and the air inside their bladder would quickly lift them up to the top of the tank. But they really seem to prefer this slow and steady approach instead, even if it means battling with your neighbors to see who can get on the mucus highway first. Now, how many of you out there were aware that bladder snails did this before watching my video? My guess is that very few people realize how amazing these snails really are, because most people probably see them as pest snails with very little redeeming value. But here at the Dave, all forms of life are incredible, and there's always so much more for us to learn from the countless little lives that live in our aquariums. So my focus is always on the creatures themselves, and that's why the camera is never pointed at me, because there's always so much more to see. Anyways, right now it's time to take another short commercial break, because these advertisements help pay for future projects that I'd like to do in the fish room. But please stick around, because I have a lot more interesting things to teach you and show you that you're not going to see anywhere else. All right, thanks a lot for sticking around to see what's next. So, you've seen how these bladder snails use mucus trails to move between the substrate and the surface. You've also seen how they use a special pore-like opening to pull in air from above the water so that they can get the extra oxygen that they need to survive. I've also pointed out that they have false gills on the outside of the shell that help them get oxygen without having to take in air from above the surface of the water. However, bladder snails can do something else that tends to make some people nervous when they see it happening. So let's take a look at that right now. Bladder snails seem to have no problem crawling right out of the water, and when fish keepers notice this behavior, they might start to get worried that there could be something wrong with their water parameters. And yes, there could be an issue with water quality that's prompting this behavior, but it might also be a response to overcrowding or a lack of food, so they've decided to go exploring in search of a less crowded place to live where there might also be more food. Furthermore, they might also leave the water if they're being pursued by a predator, and I've seen this before in my assassin snail tank. Nonetheless, this exploratory behavior might also be one of the many factors that has helped bladder snails spread all across the globe. In fact, I've seen bladder snails survive out of the water for several days at a time by using mucus to seal themselves inside their shells so that they don't dry out. And not only do they occasionally crawl out of the water, but they'll even lay their eggs just above the water line as well. But the snail that you see here is not laying these eggs, nor is it eating the eggs. It's just out for a casual stroll just above the surface of the water. Here you can see the snail's heart, and it's beating at 58 beats per minute, while the typical resting heart rate for an adult human is between 60 and 100 beats per minute. Now a tiny creature known as a cyclops has appeared just beneath the eggs. These harmless little invertebrates are great live food for baby fish. Now, here's a closer look at the same snail. Be sure to notice that it's covered in a thin coating of water, so it's in no danger of drying out anytime soon. And now it has been joined by a second snail, because they seem to follow each other as they climb out of the water, and they might be following the mucus trails left by previous snails. And in the wild, snails can follow these trails to find mates. I've never seen my ramshorn snails doing this sort of thing, and my guess is that this behavior is unique to members of the bladder snail family. And now a third snail has joined the group, all still covered by a thin film of water. These bladder snail eggs were laid just above the surface, and they're also covered in a thin film of water as well. And I've never seen ramshorn snails do this either. In fact, ramshorns are much more selective about where they'll place their eggs, preferring to lay their eggs on hard, flat surfaces, such as on large plant leaves and sponge filter uplift tubes. But they really seem to like placing their egg cases on the silicone in the corners of the aquarium, while the bladder snails will lay their eggs just about anywhere as long as it's moist enough to keep them from drying out. This bladder snail egg case has been laid on a small piece of Freshwater tang, and only a tiny part of the egg case is attached to the plant. A ramshorn snail would never be this sloppy with its egg placement. In fact, when ramshorn snails lay their eggs, the entire egg case is always fully attached to whatever object it's placed on. Here's the same bladder snail egg case just 5 days later, and the little snails inside have quadrupled in size. The eggs will take about a week or two to hatch, but the exact length of time will vary depending on the temperature of the water. Here you can see an adult bladder snail whose left tentacle has been speared by the stinging tentacle of a hydra. This is the egg case of a ramshorn snail. Notice how the individual egg capsules are neatly arranged and they don't overlap. Now this is the egg case of a bladder snail. The egg capsules are not neatly arranged in a single layer like the ramshorn snails, so they do overlap each other. Bladder snail egg cases stay clear for the duration of their incubation, while ramshorn snail eggs will turn an amber color as they mature. Here are some bladder snail eggs attached to a hornwort plant that I've removed from the water in order to show you the jelly-like consistency of their eggs. Although I've never tried it, I'd be willing to bet that if I put this hornwort and these eggs into a sealed jar without any water covering the eggs, they would still survive and hatch. Because bladder snails are true survivors that can withstand all sorts of adverse conditions. Now, hopefully I've given you a deeper appreciation and understanding of these amazing little snails and all of the really cool things that they do to survive in a world that's often harsh and unpredictable. Yes, many people view them as pests and not worthy of a second look, but once you take the time to really observe them and learn about their lives, you'll see that they're fascinating little snails. And yet, there are very few channels out there that would take the time to make a half-hour long video about bladder snails. But here at the Dave, that's exactly what I've done, because all creatures are worthy of our time and our attention, and they're all fascinating in their own way. So, if you enjoy these unique videos filled with beauty and information that you won't find anywhere else, please consider supporting this one-of-a-kind fish-keeping channel in any way that you can. Thank you so much for watching until the very end, and I really hope that you have a beautiful day.